Good afternoon, good morning, depending on what part of the country you're in, and welcome to our first Founders Forum at DAO Labs. I'm John McGarvey. I'm one of the co-founders of DAO, and we're very excited to have all of you taking a little of your day out to join us to talk about, a very topical topic, depending particularly on what part of the country you are. The impact of allergies and pollen season, I guess we call it from a FDA standpoint. But I'm really excited to be moderating today's talk. We want to keep this very casual as it relates to a rather serious topic. But joining me today are my colleagues, Tracy Dwight, who's very responsible from a community engagement standpoint of making these things happen. And some of you who are joining us may have met Tracy already, received samples from her, collaborated from a social media perspective. And then the other participant is my colleague and co-founder, Dr. Eric Karchmer, who I'll talk about here in a second. He's going to be leading us through to the discussion this afternoon. So there's a couple of odds and ends. This webinar is designed for practitioners. So consumers might find their way in here, and you're more than welcome to participate and ask us questions and whatnot. But a lot of the things that Dr. Eric is going to be talking about this afternoon are very, very much designed to speak to the practitioner or the acupuncturist that has much more formal training. So from that perspective, the topics and the terminology he'll get into might be over the layperson's head, but the product itself is not. This is a formula that's been around for, in some cases, depending on the text, nearly 1,000 years. And the application is very, very wide as it relates to immunity boosting and just trying to stay healthy. But given the time of the year, and it is pollen season, there's some wonderful magic that this formula does to really help people who are suffering from season pollen issues, myself included. And I'm a skeptic with all the things of Chinese medicine at times, particularly stuff that we put our name behind. And I can tell you unequivocally, as somebody who suffered from seasonal issues for as long as I've been alive, this thing works, and it's really exciting. So a couple of odds and ends before I turn it over to Eric. Eric is joining us today from his faculty office at Appalachian State University, where he's a tenured professor there. Eric's background in Chinese medicine is quite impressive. He attended Beijing University of Chinese Medicine for about 6 years in the early 2000s, and he's practiced ever since then, but he's an old China hand, as we say. He's spent a lot of his professional career in that part of the world. He now speaks globally, which is quite impressive on the topic, and he informed me last night he's off to Beijing next month to participate in a forum. And from what I've heard and from what some of his patients have told me, he's a very impressive acupuncturist as well. So as it relates to the topic and being able to be an authority on this stuff, Eric's pretty good. The final thing I'll say is please ask questions. There's a Q&A button at the bottom. We'd like to get to as many questions as you have. But please ask them throughout the discussion, and I'll try to jump in and have Eric address as many of them in real time as possible. And if we don't get to them, or if you've got questions after the fact, there's contact information, and you can follow up with us, and we'll get you an answer. And then the final thing I'll say before we kind of turn it over to Eric is, as a company, we have 4 values, and we take them really seriously. And they're innovation and authenticity. It's purity in what we do. It's expertise in our craft and our trade. And it's a shared experience. And the purpose of these webinars is to kind of touch on all of those. These are all sustainably sourced herbs that we test religiously. Eric is great when it comes to being a knowledge source, but we really want to make this as much a shared experience as possible, and that's why we are facilitating these discussions. So I will wrap up my sort of ditty here and turn it over to Eric, but please ask questions along the way, and thanks for joining us. So Eric, with that introduction, I'll let you kick off a discussion of Yu Ping Feng San and its application this time of year.
Well, welcome, folks. Thanks for joining us. This is an exciting topic to talk about, and an exciting formula too. And today's plan is to give a little bit of an overview about how we can think about allergies through the lens of Chinese medicine. And then why this formula immunity support can be so useful, particularly during sort of pollen seasons. And then we're going to open it up for some questions and answers at the end, and we could bring in a little discussion of some acupuncture points for practitioners out there who are interested in thinking about how to combine this formula with some acupuncture treatments. And so looking forward to looking forward to kind of having this discussion with you. So to begin with, our first question is, pollen is upon us. We're in this. It's spring in many parts of the country. Flowers are out. Pollen is in the air. One of the things we want to understand through the lens of Chinese medicine is, why do some of us suffer so badly from pollens? Now, when I studied Chinese medicine in China, one thing that never came up was allergies, actually. There's not really a big part of our curriculum. I don't know if it's because it's not a big emphasis in China or not. Certainly there's many sufferers, but it just isn't sort of the part of the traditional curriculum. So I struggled a little bit to think about allergies when I first came back to the US and started practicing here. And I think even for me, as a kind of a graduate of Chinese medicine university, I had a tough time thinking about it, and I think in my early years in practice kind of slipped into what I would say the usual way of thinking about allergies, which is that it's sort of this state of being. In fact, I had allergies since I was a kid. I remember I used to get shots for them. I don't know if they really helped a lot, but it just seemed like that was a fact of life. It was who I was. I'm a person who has allergies, and I think a lot of patients think that way. And I think practitioners sometimes may not know necessarily how to think through that and how to develop some treatments that can really help people. So it's definitely something we don't have to live with, or something we can certainly ameliorate and reduce without turning to antihistamines and some of the solutions in Western medicine, which maybe take care of the symptoms but never really get at the root of the problem. So I would say we're going to do a super quick kind of Western medicine overview about like the allergies and the immune system. We can think of allergies as sort of an overreaction of our immune system. Technically, it's called a hypersensitivity reaction. And so when we think about the immune system, which for practitioners out there, you're all keenly aware that it's not a concept in Chinese medicine, but we have other ways for thinking about it and dealing with what we would call the immune system in biomedicine. And but the task of the immune system from the biomedical perspective is this, discriminating between self and non-self, and it's incredibly complex, and it's really one of like sort of the miracles of our body, and it's difficult to wrap our minds around in its entirety. It involves many, many different parts of the body, as we see here, from lymph nodes to the bone marrow, to spleen, to the thymus, tonsils, adenoids. But for our purposes here, thinking about sort of pollen season and allergies, we want to look at what's called hypersensitivity reactions. And so let's move to the next slide. We'll move to the next slide here. And this, as you can see, is a good reminder of just how complex the immune system is. And these are sort of various ways things can go off the rails with our immune system. And we're really going to be focusing on one segment here of what's called the type 4 hypersensitivity reactions. But as you can see, we can have reactions to penicillin and drugs. We've got within type 4, we've got things like eczema, hives, would fall under the type 2 category, anaphylaxis under the type 1. So there's a lot that sort of hypersensitive reactions explain in our immune system. We don't treat them all the same way in Chinese medicine, but there are many effective means for treating many of the problems here. So we'll kind of with this notion that we're sort of dealing with a overreaction of our immune system, we're going to then now turn towards sort of a Chinese medicine perspective and think about how we can think about that through the lens of Chinese medicine. And although we can't get into there isn't sort of this same level of detail in Chinese medicine. The perspective of Chinese medicine gives us kind of some unique angles here, and the possibility of really kind of dealing with some of these underlying complexities that are happening in the immune system. So let's go to the next slide. Here we need to kind of go back to some of our most basic principles from the Yellow Emperor's Inner Canon. This is a classic line that all practitioners have probably studied. This is my particular translation of it. It gets translated in many different ways, but I've translated it as when proper qi is retained, the pathogenic cannot assault the body. You might learn it as evil. You might learn the pathogenic as evil qi. Proper qi you might learn as uprighteous qi. There's different translations here, but the important part is that there is kind of two elements here. We've got something on the outside, the pathogenic, the heterodox qi, the evil qi, that's challenging our body in a certain way, but we've also got something on the inside, and that's Western medicine is great at helping us think about allergens and things like that. But Chinese medicine, its strength is thinking about what's happening on the inside at this level of sort of proper qi, what's happening on the inside of the body. So let's turn to the next slide here and just continue here. So one of the confusing things, I think, at least for me when I was first starting out, but maybe for other practitioners out there, is that we tend to focus on that sort of presentation, the external factors, if you will, the allergens. So when we get allergies from pollen and dust, cat dander, we're sneezing and coughing. We've got watery, itchy eyes, a runny, stuffy nose. You might even have some sinus issues, a headache, a sore throat. And as we all know, it can be a miserable experience. We tend to focus on sort of somehow quieting down those symptoms. That's when you might turn to like an antihistamine or some other kind of biomedical solution to sort of just stop we've got to stop that reaction somehow. Interestingly, the Chinese medicine is going to focus more on that internal factor, and in this case, it's going to be called, or one common factor here is called a defensive qi deficiency. So let's turn to the next slide. I do want to point out too, which was just mentioned on the last slide, that defensive qi deficiency is not the only way to think about allergies, and you will have practitioners will encounter situations where you have patients with more severe allergies, allergies that don't start and stop with pollen season or anything like that. They just might be all year round, and I've had patients like that. In those situations, you might be dealing with something a little bit deeper. We might call that perhaps related to some sort of kidney deficiency. But in this case, and for a large number of your patients, we'll be looking at this question of defensive qi deficiency. And so I've kind of broken this down, the two parts of it here, into an excess and deficiency kind of columns. These are classic ways of doing a diagnosis in Chinese medicines. Practitioners know this all very well. So on the left side, what we would call the excess size, that's the most familiar side here. And the way we would define that excess is we want to call it wind. We can literally think of like allergens floating around on little puffs of air. They are kind of being carried by the wind. That's what's bringing the allergens to us. That's what's causing the symptoms. And for those of you, for practitioners, you may be familiar with this is my own translation here, but there's a phrase in Chinese medicine, feng xing shan xing shuo bian, which means that the nature of wind is movement. Wind moves and causes frequent change. So anytime you see things that are moving around the body, changing or coming on suddenly, like one moment you're fine, the next minute you want to gouge your eyes out and your nose won't stop running, and you just can't. You don't have enough tissues to deal with that nose. Those are signs of wind. So wind explains that sudden onset of symptoms. What we forget about, however, is on the other side, on the right side here, on this deficiency column, and this is where we have to kind of step back as practitioners or as consumers. We have to step back instead of thinking of I'm just the person who has this problem. We want to kind of like think about why is it that I have it, or why is it for the practitioner, why is it that this patient has it, but other patients are totally fine during allergy seasons. They're not suffering at all. And so it's that vulnerability that is our concern here. Now, why is there a vulnerability? Why does it come on? Why do you have it as a kid and not as an adult, or why vice versa? You were fine as a kid, but as an adult, for some reason, something has happened, and now you get allergies every year. In biomedicine, we tend not to answer those questions. We sort of just, say, well, it's just you. It's just who you are. It's constant, or maybe it's a constitutional thing, but that's not something we deal with in biomedicine. In Chinese medicine, that's precisely the question we want to address. And it may be constitutional, and may be related to disease histories, and may be related to the fact that you're a woman and you had 4 children. That's a lot for your body to go through, or it just could be in age as well. So there's a lot of factors that can lead to the problem of deficiency. So the good news is that Chinese medicine is great at dealing with problems of deficiency, and this formula, Yu Ping Feng San, is really wonderful for looking at that. And so this is a famous formula. It goes back at least sort of 1,000 years in the literature. It's well known. Practitioners might not know it as something that for treating allergies, and that's certainly not how I learned it. I learned it as something for treating frequent kinds of preventing frequent colds and upper respiratory tract infections. We'll talk about that use in a second as well. But the formula is known for supplementing qi, for fortifying, or maybe the word might even be consolidating, perhaps even defending the exterior, and for stopping excessive sweating. So sweating is a big deal in a lot of classic Chinese medicine literature. I feel like we live in environments that are often like air conditioned and temperature controlled, and we don't see a lot of sweating, excessive sweating in our patients as much as we might read about in the classic Chinese medicine literature. But that's sort of the typical description of it. And then some of the uses, are the most classic one is this idea of like recurrent colds and upper respiratory tract infections. The one we want to talk about today is like an allergic rhinitis, a chronic allergic rhinitis. It's hard to sometimes think of those two things as being similar, but in fact, the Chinese medicine explanation for both of them has a lot of overlap here. And essentially, you're dealing with basically some sort of defensive qi deficiency plus wind. So let's look at the formula now. It's actually a very simple formula. It's a small formula. It's just three herbs in it. If we break them down to, you'll see also that how this, and we're going to kind of go through the herbs one by one because they're so interesting here. But if we just look at the makeup of the formula, we see we've got 2 herbs that are known as sort of qi supplementing or qi tonifying herbs. And we've got 1 that's for dispersing wind. So if we just look at the makeup of the formula, the emphasis is clearly on the deficiency here, treating that qi deficiency, and then a little help with some wind dispersing herbs. So we've got Astralagus, Atractylodes, Huangqi, and Baizhu in Chinese medicine. And then our wind dispersing herb is Feng Feng, Siler root, or sometimes it's got a couple different Latin names here that are used. Sapochnicovia is the one used a little bit more maybe, but anyways, 2 qi tonifying herbs, 1 wind dispersing herbs. Now what I'd like to do next is get into just a little bit some commentary on this formula, and I think this can really help enlighten us on how this formula works. So I've picked up some commentary from a famous Qing Dynasty scholar, well known for his commentaries on the Shanghan Lun, the treatise on cold damage disorders. You can see he lived from 1662 to 1735. So he's one of the sort of the most revered sort of scholars of Chinese medicine and late imperial history. And here's what he writes. This is my translation. So he says, if pathogens invade, that should be invade, one's qi must be deficient. So this is also, that line goes together with our previous line earlier in the talk, from the same passage in the inner canon, the same idea of like external pathogens and some sort of inner deficiency. So if pathogens invade, one's qi must be deficient. Therefore, when treating wind, do not worry that you lack the means to drive it away. Rather, be concerned whether you can defend against it. So here what this passage is saying is that driving away wind, which often requires sort of pungent, dispersing herbs, there's lots of things you can do with. There's a couple dozen herbs that all can drive wind away very effectively. But that's not your problem when you've got the kind of condition that calls for this immunity support or Yu Ping Feng San. The problem is that you cannot drive, that you can't defend against the wind. Let's then go individually to the herbs here. So then he said, this is the order that he treats them in. He says, so we're going to talk about wind first and sila root. So sila root is a panacea for treating all wind disorders. It travels all over the body, clearing the head and 7 orifices above, eliminating bone, and joint pain internally, resolving spasms externally in the limbs. So sila root is a famous, feng is a famous herb for treating wind. And you can just see from this passage here, it goes well beyond what we're talking about today, allergies. It's also would be used in a rheumatoid arthritis treatment. It can also be used in any kind of tremor or spasm. Extremely useful, interesting herb. It treats wind, and one of the things people like the most about it in Chinese medicine is that it's not overly drying, and it disperses, but it doesn't do it in a way that's sort of damaging to the body. So that's let's go to our next one. And so this passage, I think, is also particularly interesting. So it's a little bit of explanation also about what is defensive qi. So Ke Qin writes, defensive qi warms the muscles, enhances the skin, fatten its protective barrier. Now, a little of the word in there is fatten, protective barrier. We can talk about what that is in a second, and controls opening and closing of the pores. Only Astralagus root can supplement the 3 burners and strengthen the defensive qi. It is a key to managing the pores. So the pores are sort of where wind is going to be coming in the body, but more broadly, the skin, what I've called the protective barrier, the muscles, these are all this external layer, and this is how sort of an invading wind pathogen gets into the body. Astragalus, interestingly, is an herb that both tonifies qi, and usually we think of that as working on the interior of the body, but it also goes to the exterior. So that's what makes it such an important herb in this case. So it both goes to the interior and to the exterior, and in going to the exterior, it defends it, as he says, strengthens the defensive qi. So it's both inside the 3 burners and outside the external qi, and that's what's going to be that key to sort of defending against wind. And then let's look lastly at the third herb, Baiju or Atractylodes. Strengthens the stomach and spleen, warms the muscles, cultivates earth. Earth is the 5 element or 5 phases that is related to stomach and spleen, to quiet wind. So we've got 3 herbs here, and then Ke Qin's got a little bit more to sort of talk about how they all combine together nicely. So let's go to that final slide here. So he says, therefore, sila root excels at driving out wind. So remember, we needed to drive out wind, but that's not the hard part. And so it's how it's going to combine with the other 2 that's important. So he says, together with Astragalus, it consolidates the exterior and defends against the external pathogens. Together with Atractylodes, it consolidates the interior and supports the internal processes of the body more broadly. And so there's something inside to help defend against the outside. So what does all this mean? Well, if it's if it's pollen season, you're struggling with allergies. For me, it seems to be my eyes. This is a great chance to use something like DAO Immunity Support. What's impressed me the most, and as I said, I mentioned initially, I didn't feel like I had a good understanding of how to treat allergies in my practice. And so what's impressed me the most is sort of, as I've kind of come to understand like this application of the formula, is how quickly it works. So I take it in, I use it in within sort of, I would say 15, 20 minutes, suddenly I'm noticing a reduction in symptoms. I would have thought that, maybe only an antihistamine could work that quickly. I've been impressed at how fast something like immunity support works. So when it's really bad, and again, this is for your typical sort of allergy patient, where it's really a defensive qi, a deficiency. So practitioners, you're going to have to use your own assessment skills here, your own diagnostic skills. If it's something beyond that, you may need something in addition to immunity support to really do that, or you might want to combine with acupuncture. But twice a day when it's really bad, and then you can kind of do once a day, or maybe even as needed to kind of deal with flare-ups as they come along. Great. So that's a little bit about how to use immunity support and why it can be so effective for allergies. We can also talk, I'm also really happy to talk about how incredible this formula is for like preventing colds and sort of upper respiratory tract infections. I've written a little bit about the DAO Labs website too, so you can go to some of those blog articles. It's life-changing really in both of these, in dealing with both of these problems. So anyways, I'm happy to take any of your questions at this point.
Eric, thank you. That was awesome. One question that we did get concerns anything that you've learned as far as acupuncture points. One of our participants from Portland is just saying they're not getting a lot of that necessarily. What have you found that works, and anything just as you're kind of going through this process of like discovering, what points would you recommend?
Well, for some acupuncture points here, we want to be careful of not like using our sort of herbal medicine theories to sort of perhaps misinterpret some of our acupuncture applicants or treatments. But in general, I think the same kind of thinking is what's key here. So we want to think about how can we supplement qi? How can we tonify the body a little bit so that we're dealing with that proper qi problem? And that's what's going to help us eliminate wind. And then we can do a few points for wind as well. Some points that I like would be something like spleen 3, Tai Bai, which is, and I often will combine this, and this is I'm totally stealing this from one of my teachers in Beijing, but I would combine it with maybe Lung 5, Chi Zi. So those two are, both of those are on sort of the Tai Yin meridians. They can, they'll help supplement qi, but because Chi Zi, L5 is also in the lung meridians, you've got the benefit of kind of dealing with lungs, which makes a lot of sense here. Another point that might be really useful would be bladder 12, Feng Men. So the name in Chinese medicine is literally the gate of wind. So this could be useful to drive out wind. If you're having a lot of if you're having if itchy eyes or the nose or just sort of scaling patients, I would also, I might frequently use GB20, which is Feng Shi. That's a very common point. Also the wind, pool of wind is the name in Chinese medicine. But there's lots of other points you could use here. So are very common points, things like stomach 36, Du Sanli would also be a great combination as well. If you happen to have a patient who has some wheezing, I would definitely recommend sort of what's called, I guess, one of the extra points. And I don't know the numbers for this one, but it's Ding Chuan Xue, which means the name of the point in Chinese is to literally to control wheezing. And this would be at this just like half a cun to the left or right of where DU14, the Dumai point of Dajue. So just to the left or right of that, that's also a really powerful point for any kind of wheezing. And I've done that for patients where like an allergy attack is kind of really powerful and leading to like some real strugglings with breathing.
Well, and that actually brings up another question. Can you talk about, between the herbs and the acupuncture points that you just touched on, can you talk about some of your results and some of the success that you've had? And I mean, it sounds as though this has been something that you've, a little bit of self-discovery, and then also from the training that you had in Beijing. Can you just talk about like the path that you've gone on, and then some of the successes, if you will?
For treating allergies?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
I mean, this has just become a bit of like this is just something we almost always keep like in the cabinet at home now for whenever we have like a flare up at home. So super useful. It's in terms of how it. I mean, it's not. I don't know if it's a big secret that this is a treatment for allergic rhinitis, but it's definitely not sort of how the formula was originally taught to me. So I mean, I think it just took I understood it as initially as a formula for treating like a deficient, some sort of deficient cold, a deficient qi leading to frequent colds. And so that's more how we would typically use it in Chinese medicine. But in terms of how to, dealing with allergies, it's kind of an essential part of your treatment. I think whether you have sort of some like simpler cases where sort of as we sort of have in our family where it's just like itchy eyes or something like that, or more complicated cases where I've had patients who've had like year-round allergies that are like interrupting sleep at night, and it doesn't matter if it's the winter, spring, summer, or fall. They just are sort of constant. This turns out to be just an important part of it. So I think mostly it's been this idea of like understanding defensive qi and preventing the invasion of wind rather than sort of dealing with this problem of wind. That was sort of the part that was hard for me to think through initially. I don't know if that answers your question. Sorry.
No, it's good. It sounds like it's just a go-to for you, and then the acupuncture points that you layer on top.
Yeah, I mean, this is definitely. I have friends whose practice has been sort of built around treating allergies. So this formula would be kind of an essential for that. You may need to add to it for the more complicated cases, and some of the acupuncture points will can be very helpful. And if you do combine it, then you've got the flexibility of addressing some of those other complications. So you may have patients that where you're finding that there's also like really complicated digestive issues as well. That then leads to, that's part of what's causing this defensive qi deficiency. Atractylodes and Astralagus help with that, but that might not be quite enough. So then then in your acupuncture practice, you can be addressing some of those other issues and be dealing with using other points for those. So if it's a patient, say, who's just had a child, she's postpartum, very deficient from that, then you might get into some points that are a little bit more blood tonifying, and so in other words, you're sort of this immunity support can be kind of a foundation, and then this is something that you add to it to help round out the picture and deal with the like additional complexities that you might see in the patient.
Gotcha. And then you had mentioned that there are some other applications that you like to use this formula for. I guess if we could just spend a minute or two on how else you would recommend both Yu Ping Feng San, and then I guess if I could make a personal plug on the DAO Labs front, this is kind of my go-to at this juncture anytime I get on an airplane. for years I was taking other sort of powdered vitamin supplements like Airborne and Emergency, and I think our society is kind of conditioned to take that before they get on a plane at this juncture, and this has been such a more powerful formula for the reasons that you've described and what I've just kind of come to experience. So I guess if you could add some commentary and color as far as how else Yu Ping Feng San can be applied outside of pollen season, I think that would be really interesting.
Yeah, so probably the most famous use for this formula is to treat sort of these chronic, recurrent colds. And so when we think about, just to back up for a second, when we think about a cold or upper respiratory tract infection, it is also a problem of wind, very much like allergies are. But it usually, we would also further refine that, would say it's wind and cold or wind and heat typically. I see cold more than I see heat, but we can debate sort of the finer points there. But we just think of it typically as a problem of wind plus something, wind and cold. We don't really worry, we don't think too much in Chinese medicine about sort of any sort of internal dimensions to that problem. Everyone is going to get sick at a certain point. It's going to happen to us a couple of times a year, once or twice, hopefully not much more than that. But if you encounter a patient where it's happening on a regular basis, the sort of situation where you get a cold, you're kind of down, and maybe it's a little bit worse than your usual cold, or maybe it's the flu, and then the patient seems to be just recovering from that, and sure enough, the next thing that comes along knocks you down, and you're sick again, and then in a typical flu season, you might end up getting sick 5 or 6 times, and that's a terrible situation. You're missing a lot of work. You're miserable. The recovery, each recovery may seem to take longer than the one before. That's a situation where immunity support is also like the only thing that's going to kind of get you out of that rut, because the situation now is no longer just wind and cold or whatever external or dampness or whatever external pathogen it is. It's also a problem of some kind of Qi deficiency, and this can come about for a lot of reasons. It could be some of the more memorable cases. I'm thinking of my own grandmother, who about at age 90 was struggling, living in Florida and struggling with kind of going between sort of highly air-conditioned rooms and sort of the warm Floridian air, and just that sort of change in temperature was enough to kind of get her sick. And remember her getting sick, also 5 or 6 times in a winter. And immunity support was the thing that sort of turned it around for her. Or likewise, I'm thinking of some patients, a friend of mine who was kind of postpartum, kind of recovering from having a child, and again, repeated colds 3 or 4 times in a row, and immunity support was sort of the thing that sort of stopped that pattern too. It can really be anything that doesn't necessarily take that much. My mother-in-law, another example, school teacher, just around kids, snotty kids, young kids every day, where there's a lot going around. But she was also getting hit with multiple colds every flu season, and really struggling each time. So she's another one who did very well with this formula, and was able to totally sort of interrupt that process. So when you take this, it doesn't mean that you're necessarily not going to get a cold again, but it's going to give you that strength, that defensive Qi to protect against them, and so that you're much less likely to get one. So, and this is why this will be so much more useful for your long plane trips and your all the exposures that you have, like while you're traveling, then versus something like an emergency, which is it tastes good, but I don't know if it's really going to do much for you. The problem here, what's great about this formula is that it gives you that internal support, so that you can defend against colds and be much stronger and much less likely to get one.
Awesome.
Yeah.
We said we would keep this to about 40 minutes or so, and we're bumping up against that. So a couple of things. One, we'll summarize this talk, and we'll circulate it to the community here. I'd also point out that if you haven't tried it before and you're interested, we do have a little incentive for you. Just use code Pollen at checkout, POLLEN, and we can get you a little bit of a discount on it. It's good stuff. And then finally, if you're a practitioner and you are interested in carrying this or any other item in your clinic, reach out to my colleague Stephanie, whose contact information can be found there. As I said at the top of the call, this is very much a shared experience, and Eric obviously has demonstrated his knowledge of this item, but I can tell you, having worked with him for about 4 years, 5 years now, like, this is just the tip of the iceberg. And so if there's other questions that come up after the fact that you'd love to get some color on, by all means, send them our way, and we'd love to circulate an answer back to you. So that's it. The final point I would make is there's a webinar next Tuesday, I believe, that's being hosted by one of our practitioner partners, and the topic is on again, as extension of our women's formula and our women's kit, talking about a woman's natural cycle. And so it's going to be a great discussion by Dr. Christine Gonzalez, and the information for that is on our Facebook page. So that's it, folks. Eric, thanks so much for your time and insight earlier today or throughout the last 45 minutes. And we'll let everyone go about their day and go conquer allergy and pollen issues through this extremely powerful practice.
Yeah, give it a try. It's a life changer.
Sounds good. All right, thanks everybody.
Thanks,
Eric.